Sesh, and thank you, Mr. Vishwanathan, for a very stimulating session. I mean, it was a pleasure hearing Montek. It was a pleasure hearing Mr. Krishnan. And let me now add my two pennies to the conversation. You know, the national monetization pipeline as an economic strategy for the nation is very clearly an inevitability. It had to happen, whether you called it by any other name or any other label. Uh, for the simple reason that there are three forces at work simultaneously, which is leading in this direction. The, the first is, let us step back and understand the nature of infrastructure risk and investment. All infrastructure projects very simply fall into three buckets: development risk, construction risk, and operating risk. What we did in the early days of the PPP program was we addressed the hardest part. We offered greenfield projects in power sector, roads, in ports, and airports. We offered the hardest part, which included development, construction, and obviously it would lead on to the operation risk. What NMP does is it clearly recognizes that there is really very little confidence and appetite for private investors in the first two stages, which is development risk and construction risk. It recognizes that reality. And having recognized that reality, it then says, okay, guys, come into the area which is definitely less riskier, where construction, development and construction risk has been removed. Here is an operating project. So let's monetize that. So it recognizes the reality that we are now asking private capital to come in at a last, less riskier stage. That's force number one. Force number two is, as I mentioned, a serious diminution of appetite of Indian private sector as well as international private investors of the large infrastructure operating types have all left the country. And a large Indian corporates like L&T and others have vowed at their boards that we are not going to touch PPP again. Nor are bankers encouraging them, nor are the banks lending. And therefore, the appetite for greenfield infrastructure amongst investor community is practically not there. It's a complete erosion of confidence in the PPP format and PPP processes. So that's force number two. And that reality has been recognized. The third recognition of reality is what is it that domestic and largely international capital. If you see the last few PPP projects, it is international capital that is coming in a big way. The Canadian Pension Fund, CPP, CPPIP, CDPQ, Swedish funds, Singaporeans, the Gulf, these are all either sovereign funds or insurance funds or pension funds. That is the class of capital that needs to come into infrastructure, which has that capital is patient capital, it is long-term capital, and is looking at annuity yields. What do we have to offer them? We have to offer them operating brownfield assets, which have demonstrated stable or semi-stable cash flows at least. So I am just outlining these three forces which are working at tandem. The erosion of confidence in the first two risks, development and construction, acceptance of the third bucket, which is operating risk, a complete loss of confidence from the Indian corporate sector and from the operating infrastructure companies in putting more money into greenfield PPPs, and a reasonably large appetite, a very large appetite for operating assets, which is not only supported by standalone institutions, but are also supported by new instruments like InvITs and REITs. InvITs and REITs do not support greenfield investments. They support the offloading of operating infrastructure projects. You got these three forces at work. And what the national monetization pipeline does is I don't know whether anybody's thought through this at this level of structural detail, but what it effectively does in practice is that it recognizes these three ground realities and carves a scheme by saying, okay, we've got a stock of brownfield assets, the government needs money, and domestic and international capital love operating projects and annuity investments. So here we go. So in that sense, I think it's a virtuous cycle that has been established. Sell the brownfield assets and recycle the money into government itself, at least for the time being, till PPP is reset. Let the government structure the first two portions, development risk and construction risk, and operate through EPC companies. And so when EPC has delivered, probably a year or two after that, it is ready for monetization. So there is a correlation between NIP and NMP, which to my mind, if properly executed, leads to a virtuous cycle, and nobody in economics can doubt it. I now want to address the contentious issue of states that Mr. Krishnan raised. There is no question that there is a debate on cooperative federalism, competitive federalism, abandoned federalism. These are debates which are happening all the time, not just in the infrastructure space, but in the larger societal space. However, if you look at the detail of the NMP scheme, I was rather, shall I say, heartened to see that for once the central government actually has provided some windows of, shall I say, appreciation for the state's position in the NMP, whether it is privatizing state-owned utilities or central PSU, and I'll read it out to you. The incentives on states on NMP, if the states divest a PSU and raise funds, a PSU, the central government will give them 100% of that as financial assistance. It's there, I've noted this down, it's in the NMP scheme. If a state divests a PSU, the center will give them 100% of that amount as financial assistance. If not fully, it partly addresses the issue that Mr. Krishnan has raised. The second point is, if they monetize the asset, then government will give them 33% of the amount. And if states list a public company in the stock market and raise funds, the government will give them 50% of that amount. So while it may not completely address the issues of center-state federalism and bonhomie and cooperation, it recognizes the fact that if states make an effort, the central government will go out of its way to compensate them. And I think it's an important point that we should not miss in this debate. There is an attempt to incentivize states, if I may put it that way. The second important point is that I'm going to do some little bit of simple maths for you. Once you understand that the NIP and NMP are linked at the hip, the important point is how much PPP, how much private capital are we planning to raise? Now, very clearly, the NIP is 20 lakh crores per annum is the plan, 111 lakh crores for 5 years, roughly 20 lakh crores per annum, of which 30% is to come from private capital. So 30% of 20 lakh crores is 6 lakh crores, right? Now, so far as the NMP is concerned, it's a 4-year program of 6 lakh crores, 1.5 lakh crores, 100% of which is going to come from private capital. That's the whole idea. So 6 plus 1.5 is 7.5 lakh crores. So every year, now this is the point that Montek also made, we are stretching ourselves to a humongous level to attract domestic and foreign capital in the combination of these two projects. We are supposed to be raising 7.5 lakh crores, right? Now, the question is, therefore, how much have we done in the past? And I will read out the figures from you. Montek, I did some deep dive on your prodding me to find out about gross capital formation in infra. I will share with you later that I did find the figures in bar charts in the NIP pipeline detailed documents in the annexures. I will share that with you separately. I picked out the figures from there. Keep in mind that we require 7.5 lakh crores per annum for mobilizing private capital, domestic and foreign. In 2016, we did 3 lakh crores. In 17, we did 2.6 lakh crores. In 2018, we did 2.5 lakh crores. And in 2019, we've done 2.5 lakh crores. I would suspect that in this pandemic period, we probably have done less at around 2.0 lakh crores. The official figures are not out. Let's stay with the figure of 2.5 lakh crores. That's the maximum we have done in the last 3 years in mobilizing private capital for greenfield and brownfield for infra. And now you're saying we need to do 7.5, right? So we have to stretch ourselves to do 3 times more. In the current context of capital shortage, both in public expenditure as well as in private sector balance sheets, what is required is now I am going, the reason I said these figures is that it is a very, very large stretch target. And to achieve that, there is to be we have to reset PPP on a war footing. Now, the discussions on PPP can carry on till midnight, Mr. Vishwanathan, and I don't think your audience will like it. We panelists may love it. But I want to make 2 short points that unless PPP is completely reset on a war footing, you are not going to be able to mobilize 7.5 lakh crores when you're effectively doing 2 or 2.5. So what is required in PPP reset? 1, you require the Kelkar committee report addresses most of the things that have been discussed about PPP. It was a very eminent, erudite, grounded committee that made a whole set of recommendations. I don't want to go over it because it touches on issues of independent regulation, renegotiation, protection of bureaucrats from arbitrary inquiries, even post-retirement, etc., etc., etc. It's got a laundry list of everything required to reset PPP. And if any of your delegates just download the executive summary on Google, you don't need me to waste further time on it. So point number 1, by the way, the Kelkar committee was set up by this government. It was not set up by the UPA government. By the time the government inherited in 2014, PPP had crashed for very good reasons. which we are learning now. But this government had set up the Kelkar Committee report. So in a sense, this government has a moral obligation to, in a sense, address the recommendations and say which it appreciates, which it doesn't. But in some senses, it has chosen to ignore the report, which I find very difficult to digest. So the Kelkar Committee has a long laundry list. It doesn't require one more seminar to discuss the ills of how to rectify PPP. It's done. Just read the report. Don't even read the report, read the executive summary. Point number 2, this government, in the first budget speech of Mr. Jaitley in July 2014, set aside 500 crores to set up a PPP knowledge foundation called 3P India. Now, why did Mr. Jaitley do it? Because he was well advised by leading economists that if you do not have a knowledge, impartial, neutral, knowledge sharing, centralized institution to manage the PPP process, you are likely to go haywire, which is exactly the way we have gone. If you see the last 2 bids, the Indian Railways privatization bid attracted 113 very interested parties in the pre-bid conferences. When the bids opened, there were only 2, IRCTC and Mega Engineering. What happened? The PPP formatting was all wrong. If you read today's newspapers, you'll realize that there have been 3,000 objections raised to the PPP format of BharatNet, which is the optic fiber linkage to the panchayats. So the problem, even in the national monetization plan, the problem that I see it is that there are 16 central ministries and you add some of the other appendages at the center. You add Ministry of Finance, NITI, PMO, and Law and Justice. You got 20 organizations at the center. Now, the states are also supposed to monetize their assets. So let us even take the top 10 states and assume that there are 4 departments in the states, roads, housing, etc., that are going to privatize some assets. So 10 states into 4 departments in a state is 40 organizations, and there are 20 at the center. So 60 organizations are now going to hire consultants and apply their and tell all their IAS officers to say, please develop your own PPP format now. I mean, this is ridiculous. 60 organizations are going to rediscover what kind of a format they require for PPP, right? So the railways do their number, the roads and highways ministry do their number. In the state, the water department does its number, the urban ministry does its, urban department does its number. So everybody is free to do their number. And when the bidding happens, what happens is what we have seen in the Indian Railways bid, what we are seeing in the BharatNet bid, and we are seeing across many, many bids that end up wasting time and effort and come to naught. There is no question that we need a central repository of knowledge that puts together, and there has to be some kind of a mandate to say that if you are PPPizing something, please pass it through the 3PR Institute, and they should act as some kind of a quality control, which we have in all the manufacturing centers in our country. We have R&D, we have quality control, and you don't leave everything to production. So we need a 3P India to harmonize the PPP movement over and above recommending the Kelkar Committee, over and above implementing the Kelkar Committee stuff. If we do not do soft stuff like this, then I'm afraid that this will just remain a plan on paper. First, the enormity of the target, and secondly, the absence of an institutional framework that accumulates knowledge and harmonizes the efforts. As I said, 60 different people are going to play their own tune. God help us. I'm actually going to stop to say there are 2 requirements. One, people have mentioned it before me, transparency. There is a widespread fear of crony capitalism in the award of infrastructure bids. I do not wish to say more. It is a clear and palpable fear. And that needs to be addressed by assuring the public at the state level, at the central level, across the country, that the bids are transparent and, like Caesar's wife, the processes are above suspicion. It needs to be done. It needs to be demonstrated. The second thing is ring fencing the proceeds from monetization. I am afraid the way that, we pay 400 rupees a ton for coal cess. It was meant to fund greenization of thermal power projects so that you put all the pollution equipment and reduce pollution. Do you know what the coal cess is used for? Everything else from cleaning the Ganga to reducing the fiscal deficit. So my worry is, and earlier it was done with the Central Road Fund also. There is a 100 rupee or whatever, not 100 rupee. There is a 1 rupee, 2 rupee cess on diesel and petrol, which is supposed to fund the roads. That also has been diverted for other purposes. So in the central government, I'm not talking about the states, we have a vast history across different governments of misusing funds that are meant to be ring-fenced and escrowed. So my fear again is, at the state level, at the central level, once an asset is monetized, as a citizen of the country, where do I get the assurance that it's going to be plowed back in infrastructure and not going to be used for any, splurging on unnecessary expenses? So I think the NMP needs to go one step further and announce to the public a methodology of ring fencing the proceeds so that the virtuous cycle is built and doesn't remain in theory. That's all I had to say, and I'm going to stop now.
Vinayak, you're the very reason why I don't ever attempt to answer questions or even make statements when you are around. So I'm happy that I stopped with questions. In the interest of time, I'm not going to make any further comments. I know you, in any case, you've left with very little questions to be asked further. So I'm going to circle back to Montek to get his views on what Krishnan said about the issue relating to the state autonomy and the state participation as a stakeholder in this entire program. Vinayak has made his observation, but I thought it's very important to listen to you, what you have in mind on that.